Hello and welcome to the August webinar series by EuroSTAR Conferences. The title of today's webinar is Test Script-Free Validation in a Regulated Environment, Kanban Style. And the presenter of today's webinar is Andy Glover. If you have any questions for Andy during the course of the webinar, please type them into the questions field on your control panel, and I will ask these questions to Andy directly at the end of the webinar. Just remember, you can type these questions at any point and we will address them at the end. A copy of these slides, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be available on the EuroSTAR website after the webinar. You can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ESConf, and you can connect with us, the EuroSTAR Conferences, at @ESConf, and you can also connect with today's presenter, Andy Glover, at @CartoonTester. So now I'm going to hand you over to today's presenter, Andy. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Jar. Okay, hopefully you can see my presentation slide. So thank you, Dara, for the introduction, and thank you, EuroSTAR, for hosting the webinar. And a special thanks to everyone attending the webinar. I hope I'll be able to provide a few software testing gems for you over the next hour. So let's crack on. Here's the agenda, the list for today's webinar. It's kind of divided into 4 sections, and I've done it into a little nice drawing. I hope you like it. The first one is about the history, and I'll be talking about working in the pharmaceutical industry. That's the one I work in at the moment. I'll then talk about pitfalls or challenges that software testers have to deal with while working in this sort of industry, followed by ideas on how to kind of approach and solve those challenges, and I'll end up with the word freedom, which is sort of the title of the talk, using Kanban Style and similar sort of tools to reduce the level of documentation. So I left that till last, like a good marketeer or a good salesperson, but hopefully there's some good stuff I also got to say before that, so do stay tuned. So the history, I'll start with my personal history. I've been in the pharma industry now over 11 years. I don't like to count, but I had to for this webinar. And most of that is as a software tester. It's over 10 years I've been a software tester. As well as that, I've been doing testing in the telecoms industry for about 2 years as well. I actually began in the pharma industry as a kind of a production programmer and developer, but I quickly moved into testing. And as a tester, there is a threat or a possibility that if I don't do my job properly, I could end up in jail. That is a possibility, and I just got to show you the next slide. There is that possibility. I mean, it's extremely unlikely. I would have to do really bad testing to the point where I'm aware that I'm doing really bad testing, and I choose to carry on doing really bad testing. And that's not the kind of person I am, so it's very unlikely that will happen. But the threat is there. And that's because there are rules and laws you have to follow as you work in this sort of industry. So with that in mind, I'd like to propose a question to you, everyone listening. Answer the question sort of in your own head, but do provide a solid answer. Don't say yes or no, but say yes because or no because, whatever. So the question is, do you expect better testing practices in a heavily regulated environment? So I'll give you a few moments to think about that. Okay, so I hope you're able to kind of have an answer for that. The reason I sort of asked that question is because in my experience, it doesn't necessarily mean we do there's better testing in the pharma industry. What it means is that there's usually better documentation in the testing. So there's lots of test plans, test scripts. But I find that having lots of documentation doesn't necessarily mean really good testing. And I think Fiona Charles recently said the rigor of test effort does not equal the number of pages you take to describe it. So that's quite an interesting point, which I agree with. So let's talk more about the history of the pharma industry. The reasons there are laws and regulations are because over the last a few decades, people possibly with probably with good intentions, they've created new drugs and thinking they'll help people. Some of them have been positive, but some have had negative side effects, and people have died because of it. And obviously that's not a good thing, and as a society we want to avoid things like that happening again. So we've set kind of laws and regulations in place to avoid sort of bad things happening to people because of new drugs. And we've also employed people to enforce that law or the regulations. And one of the most famous bodies or people that kind of enforce the law, enforce the regulation is the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration. They're based in the US, but because the US is such a big market for medical health, many organizations around the globe have to follow FDA because they want to be able to access the US market and be able to sell either the drugs or products or services alongside those medicines. So any company who wants to kind of make some money tends to follow the FDA regulations, or at least try. So how does that affect software testing? Well, we're talking about typically drugs, but everyone uses computers, nurses, doctors, patients, and if those computers or whatever, or software is used to help with those medicines, then that software needs to be tested and validated according to how the FDA mandates it. So how does that affect testing? Well, typically what I found is, and I found this applies to a lot of other test groups I've spoken to who work in the same industry, is that the testing is often divided into two phases. Now, I'm drawing a very black and white picture, but I think this is the best way to describe what happens. And what happens is there's a lot of informal testing going on, which are called in the informal test process, and then there's a formal test process happening. And this happens pretty much in every project that's in the pharma industry, testing the software. And the formal test process tends to happen near the end of the project. It's very detailed, so you get lots of test scripts, for example, and it's very rigid, so you follow a set way of doing things. You write a test plan, then you write a test script, then you execute it, and so on. And the formal test process, it happens throughout the project. It can start from day one, and it can stop at the last day of the project. It's very flexible, and there's not much detail to it. Both processes or phases are important. They have different objectives or goals. So the informal test process is often about finding information about the software, finding bugs, raising them, and then the formal process is about getting that traceability to show that the software complies to what the requirements are specified. So they're both important phases, and they happen in most projects in the pharma industry. Now let's drill down a bit more in each one. The informal test process has its positives, benefits, but it does have a few drawbacks, and one of them is that it's very hard to describe, because it's unclear what is happening. It's hard to manage. If you don't know what's going on during this informal testing, then there's no way to improve it. And this applies to testers, test team leaders, test managers. When the informal testing is happening, it's very hard to describe what's going on. What usually happens is the software is given to the testers, and they're told to test it and hopefully find bugs. But there isn't much kind of lead into it or a mission to it. It's just given over to the testers to test it. It can be very random at times. So if you have a group of testers, experienced testers might do a very good job during this process or during this phase, but inexperienced testers might struggle, as there isn't much kind of leadership or management in this area. In contrast, we have the formal test process, and typically this is very well detailed, and it's written in procedures, standard operating procedures, where it tells the tester how to test, which templates to use, how to complete them, how to execute the testing, what to record, and so on. And it's very rigid, and it's hard to change if you do want to change the process. And typically you'll have a number of documents that you have to complete. One's the test plan, test scripts, traceability matrix, test report, issue logs are the key kind of documents that you find. And also what is usually required is a requirement spec to begin with. So a requirements document is written up, and your test scripts will be written against that. And then the traceability matrix will sit between the test scripts and the requirements document. And the standard operating procedures will tell you how to actually execute the test, and typically you need to record evidence, and that means usually taking screenshots. So as you test, you take screenshots, you save them, and all this documentation, all this evidence gets to be reviewed, needs to be reviewed by someone else in the team. So the test plan, test scripts, and so on needs to be reviewed. The person reviewing it will probably raise issues with it, comments, and you as the author or as the main tester will have to go back and update your documents, which have been, with the comments that have been raised about them. So that's sort of what happens. Like I said, is a fairly black and white picture, but I've seen this happen a number of times where the testing is sort of divided into two, with the informal and the formal testing. Now, with the formal testing, you'll think that looks very positive, that it's very well managed and documented, but there are some challenges with that. And that's what we talk about now, with some of the pitfalls as a software tester we have to deal with while working in this industry. One of them is that in principle, there's nothing wrong with the way we do the testing in terms of documentation, but because of the regulations don't specify which development life cycle to follow, but they sort of imply in a kind of reading between the lines that a waterfall is the best way, because they talk about generating requirements, then the developers have to create a design spec, then they have to code, then it's handed over to the testers who then generate test plans. So it's very waterfall type of life cycle. Now that waterfall might work, but I think most people admit or agree that there are other better development life cycles out there to be used. But the biggest problem I've found is that testers' mindset is changed due to the regulations. People, testers included, don't want to get in trouble with the FDA. They don't want to have the threat of going to jail. So they have that in mind when they do the testing, and have that as a goal. So that pretty much means that as they do testing, they're concentrating more about how they document the testing rather than the actual testing itself, which I think isn't a good thing. I think as a tester, we need to focus on the testing and not worry so much about the documentation. So that's something, that is a pitfall, I think, and I'll talk about some ideas on how to overcome that later on. Other things that affect the testers is really kind of how they approach the testing and how the tester's mindset is affected by it. And one of them is that they try to pass all the tests. Now that sounds a bit strange, trying to pass all the tests. This is around the formal testing. So you've done, as a tester, you've done lots of informal testing, and when you got to the formal testing, you're fairly confident, or hopefully you'll be confident, that the software is of good quality, and if you've run the formal test, then you don't expect to find any major bugs, or not many anyway. And what you find is that the informal testing sort of feeds into the formal testing. So as you do the informal testing, you might generate test scripts. As you do the informal testing, you learn about the software. As you do the informal testing, you start writing test scripts, you look at the requirement spec, you find bugs, you find bugs against the software, you find bugs against the requirements, and so on. And as you do that, you start writing a good set of test scripts, which then become the formal test scripts. And by that time, hopefully, you find all the major bugs, and by that time, all the tests pass. And if they don't pass, that is a problem, because then you'll have to raise an issue log, and that needs to be documented, that needs to be reviewed, and has to be signed and dated by a number of people. So if you can avoid raising issues during the formal testing, that will save you time and save the developers time. So that kind of approach isn't very good. Again, as a tester, you don't want to be thinking, I want to make sure I want this test to pass, so I don't have to worry about issue logs. You want to approach the software to see if you can find bugs and so on. Another thing about working in this industry and affects the tester's mindset is that they become reluctant to try new processes. If your current process does the job, it might not be perfect, but it seems to be working, then you carry on using that, even though you might know of a better process to use. And that's because if you want to try a new process, you need to document that new process. You have to write a brand new, maybe standard operating procedure to say, this is a new process, now the tester will do this, they will use these templates, they will do this at this time, then they'll do something else, and so on. And that takes time and effort, and it's taking time off from from testing into writing procedures, and that's not many testers like doing that, including myself. I prefer to do testing rather than writing documents. Another thing that testers are reluctant to try are new tools, similar to trying new processes. If you want to try a new tool, especially like say an automation test tool, if you want to use it during the formal testing, then you need to validate that test automation tool. You need to be able to prove to an auditor, say if an auditor comes in, you need to be able to prove to them that this test automation tool does what you expect it to do. So that means in practice you need to write a requirement spec for that test automation tool. You need to write a test plan, test scripts, execute the test, generate evidence to show that the automation tool does what you expect it to do. Again, that's a lot of work, and that's work you have to do up front, so that's time and money. So another reason why you might want to avoid using new tools and carry on doing lots of manual testing possibly, instead of using test automation. Another thing that affects the mindset, which is not a negative thing in itself, but it does have some sort of side effects, is that because the requirements typically are very good in the pharma industry, you need to generate very detailed requirements documents, but because of that means the default testing type that we use is the requirements-based testing. So most testers in this industry are very good at that. They'll be able to look at a requirement spec and generate lots of test ideas from that. Now that's very good, but the only problem is that that might be the test type they use for a project, and there are other test types that can find different types of bugs which are critical and need to be found, but because of the mentality, the way they approach the project, they'll only concentrate on their requirements-based testing. Because of the nature of the regulations, and I implied before that the waterfall seems to be the default approach. It's never black and white. I always find that it's never waterfall. It's a bit of a mixture of V model and waterfall. But because of that, it means that the testers tend to get involved at the end of the project. Another reason for that is that the regulations hint to the fact that testers and the testing should be kept separate from the rest of development, from the developers, so they are not influenced by them. Sort of that makes sense when someone explains it to you, but until you hear, especially recently, that there are many benefits on when testers and developers work together from day one. So those are sort of some of the negatives about working in this industry. You end up focusing on passing an audit, so you want to make sure your tests pass and your documentation is nice and clean, so you concentrate on documentation rather than testing. You avoid creating new processes that might be better, or you avoid using tools that might help your testing, and you end up using more of get involved at the end of the projects rather than from day one. So those are some of the pitfalls, and I just want to share some suggestions and ideas on how to kind of overcome those challenges. And that's something I've used. Most of these ideas I've used in my company or previous companies. I can't find the mouse. It's disappeared. There you go. So let's talk about some ideas. Okay, an important point. And this is something that kind of needs to remind yourself as a tester, is that the FDA don't prescribe a test approach or a test technique. As long as you document what you plan to do and document as you go along, that's what is needed from FDA regulations. So you don't necessarily have to do requirements-based testing. You can do other types of testing. So that's an important point. So it's and the second point there, that every project is different. I think having those two in mind, you should try to apply or use processes that are flexible. So you have a test approach that fits well for one project, and then have a different process for a different project. And so you kind of get, when you start a new project, you look at it, you look at its requirements, its needs, its timescales, and you decide what's the best process that fits that project, and then you follow that process. So it's important to be aware of those 2 points as you start new projects. For example, there are some projects that I worked in which are very critical, safety critical, and they require lots and lots of testing and lots of documentation. So you need a process which kind of goes down that path. Whereas I've also worked on projects which aren't critical, or certainly a lot less critical, which therefore that means you don't need as much documentation and possibly less testing as well. A good mentality to have in this, and I think this is shared amongst other industries, is that it's good to admit that testing happens from day one. So lots of testing can happen from the beginning of the project. For example, once the requirements are written, or even while the requirements are being analyzed, testing can start. We can start testing the requirements, testing the assumptions. We can question the requirement's value, the clarity, usefulness, and I think it can be a great value to add a tester from day one to start kind of raising those questions against requirements. Another thing is that if you involve from the day one, you can start asking for requirements that help the testers. Something that we've done in the past is that we ask for requirements on the software that help with our logging and generating evidence. For example, the software that we're testing generated lots of logs, so we asked for a requirement that prints all those logs out, and printing those logs out can form part of the evidence that you have to generate when you do the testing. So if you weren't involved right at the beginning of the project, those requirements are hard to ask for. It's hard to plan in something halfway through the project. Another important thing is, and I've hinted that before about the informal testing, is that it can be hard to manage, it can be hard to understand. So it's an important thing to do is to start managing the informal testing, understanding what's going on, when it happens, why certain types of testing you might want to do during informal testing, and then you can start asking questions like, does that informal testing add value? Can we improve, or can we improve it? Can we share that type of testing with other testers? If you find that testing during the informal testing is very good, it's beneficial, then you might want to suggest that you start documenting that testing. The FDA don't actually mandate what type of the test technique or type that you use, and actually recently they started saying that exploratory testing is valuable, and I think that's quite a recent thing. And although there's lots of testing going on, informal testing, you can start using more of a kind of exploratory approach, and that can still be, exploratory testing can still be managed, it can still be documented, and it can add a lot of value. Another suggestion similar to exploratory testing is using the session-based test management approach. The idea is that you divide your testing into sessions, and you give the tester a focus or a mission to test, maybe for half an hour, maybe 2 hours, to say, look tester, you now concentrate on this feature or set of features, and do that and raise issues and document as you go. That sort of approach doesn't mean it doesn't require a lot of planning. It does require a bit of planning, but it does mean you can document as you go. So you don't need to add lots of time up front in terms of documentation. Another idea that we've done many times is doing group testing sessions, where you get lots of testers for 1 hour, say, and you get them to sit down and test the same application at the very same time. You need to warn the developers. We've done that in the past and not warned them, and they got a nasty shock because we raised loads of bugs in the space of 1 hour. So that's something to be aware of. Other suggestions are like, why not get testers involved with unit testing, so work closely with the developer and suggest how to improve the unit testing. Similar to the group testing session is about freshening things up. You can also freshen things up by swapping projects around. If you have one tester per project or a couple of testers, maybe swap those testers between projects so they have fresh eyes and get a fresh look at an application. I think this is even more important in the pharma industry because of the regulations. Things get into routine very quickly, so it's good to kind of keep things fresh as much as possible. Don't settle down. I think it can be quite easy to just accept things as they are. Maybe things are going well and the process is good, but I always believe that things can improve and the process can be refined, it can be tweaked. So I think that's an important point, especially in the pharma industry, because things seem to be slow at changing. So it's kind of a good idea to focus on change on a regular basis. And with that, keep in mind that testing is hard. It's not easy. It requires investment, and again, it can be improved. One thing that I keep talking about is that testers need to understand what testing is. It's not good at just giving them a test script and telling them to run a test. It's important for them to understand why we do testing. It's important for them to be able to describe it, to communicate what testing is about, to be able to communicate that to developers, users, clients, be able to say what the testing progress is, what the testing state is. And I think a lot of testers might find this a little bit difficult because they don't get the opportunity to do that, so it's good to kind of push that. One thing that we do in our team meetings is that typically one team member will share a testing topic, maybe from even just 5 minutes up to half an hour. They'll look at a topic they're interested in. Recently we've been doing lots of kind of automation demonstrations, so that helps them to talk about testing, why they took a certain approach to that project or to that testing, and be able to describe that with other testers. I regularly think that software development as a whole is very young, and that includes software testing. And I still think that we've got a way to go to improve. So I kind of think we're in a journey. We haven't reached our destination, and maybe we never will. But we need to kind of continue to evolve and improve. And that applies to other industries, but again, in particular with the pharma industry, as it tends to be slow in using or applying new technologies. And lastly, on this slide, we need to continue to develop skills similar to understanding that good testing is hard. We need to continue to learn, continue to train, need to encourage testers to focus on learning. And luckily there's loads of areas that you can learn from. There's articles, blogs, conferences, webinars, and there's plenty of places where you can learn and practice your testing skill, which is a good positive thing, but you need to kind of provide time and focus on that and learn from that, and give yourself opportunities to practice that testing skill. Another suggestion is that think about the evidence that you're collecting. Now, in the industry, the FDA doesn't trust anyone. The FDA doesn't trust doctors, so they don't trust testers either. And that actually means that the testers end up having to generate lots of evidence to prove that the testing happened. Now, in the past and even now, the testers will generate screenshots, but the screenshots themselves are just snapshots of the software working. It doesn't really show the tester actually testing. And because of that, because the screenshots are limited, or they're not a great way to show evidence, because of that, you'll end up getting testers writing very detailed test scripts. And this is maybe one example where it's very detailed. You have the URL, you specify the username or the patient ID, you specify the password. So that's very detailed, and I think that leads to a very weak test. If you run that test and it passes, then it's unlikely that if you run it again that you'll find a bug. It's more likely if you vary some of those variables, you're more likely to find bugs. So that because of the very detailed test script, you're creating very weak tests. One other thing as well, because of the way the evidence is taken, is screenshots. Often the tester will focus on taking a screenshot. So they'll run the test, execute the test, and as they're doing it, they're more worried about making sure they take a screenshot than about whether the software is working or not. And that's obviously not a good thing. But fortunately, there's tools out there that can improve the way we generate evidence. And I think the main one, and something that I've been using now for a few years, is the video recording tools. And as you test, the video tools can record everything that's happening on the web, on your laptop, on your screen. So you press record on your computer, and it records everything on your screen. It records your mouse movements. It records your key entries. Obviously, it records everything that's displayed on your laptop. And the good thing about that, you click record, and then you do lots of testing. You do lots of testing. So you might do testing 5 minutes or 2 hours, but throughout that, you don't need to worry about evidence so much. You can just press record and focus on your testing, and at the end you can press stop, and you have a video with your evidence showing all your testing. So I think that becomes a game changer, the video. It can change how you approach testing, because in the past we recorded screenshots, we ended up writing very detailed test scripts, but with the video it shows the application working as specified on the requirements. So you have a requirement spec. You should be able to say, okay, this video shows this requirement being used on the software, and it definitely becomes a game changer. And I'll talk about my case study a bit later. But before that, I just want to use a quote. I asked a leading software tester in the US who works in the pharma industry, Griffin Jones, to review a talk I did which is similar to this one, and he showed me some presentation slides, and one quote stood out, which is abundant quality evidence mitigates your other problems. And so we kind of implies that if you've got very good evidence, then that sort of it's very good, and that you can get away with maybe not doing good at other types of documentation possibly. So that's the kind of approach I've taken, where I've concentrated on the videos, and I've generated lots of really good evidence, which means I think we can write less detailed test scripts. And this is one example, and I think we can do less detailed test scripts. And I'll show you a bit later again in the case study how we apply this approach. But this one is identical in some ways to the previous test that I showed. It's doing the same thing. You're logging into a website, and you're confirming that the website was displayed, and that's the same as the previous screen. This is one step rather than 4 steps to the previous one. So that will be be quicker to write, and also be quicker to review, because everything that you write or document has to be reviewed. So you kind of get a double benefit from it by writing less detailed test scripts. So the video itself, we've been using videos now. Videos you can use to not just record the application being used, you can also check the database. So at the same time you'll have the application running, you can look at the database to see that, for example, the data was uploaded correctly. We test a lot of phone applications, so we'll have the phone displayed on the laptop, and then as it submits data for 3G or Wi-Fi or whatever, you can then check the database, and the video will record all that, and it just shows the whole thing kind of working together. And we've had a few audits recently over the last year, and the clients or the auditors are very happy with the level of videos, level of evidence that we provided. We even convinced a client they were going to spend a lot of money in outsourcing the UAT. We provided software for them, and they wanted to do UAT. They wanted to outsource that UAT, which we found out was a lot of money. So we suggested that they look at our videos instead, and by the way, there's a lot of videos to review. So, but we thought that'll save them a lot of time and money. And actually, they ended up reviewing about a quarter of the videos, and the client was convinced that from the level of testing that we were able to show to them the level of evidence, they were very happy that they didn't need to outsource the UAT. So that was a really positive result for the test team. And I'll get back to video recording in the last section of the talk, where I talk about kind of test script free validation. But for now, I just want a couple of quick slides about Agile and automation. We have implemented Agile in certain projects. Just to clarify that we have different types of projects in the company I work for. Sometimes it fits to use Agile, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it fits to write very detailed test scripts, although we don't do that so much now. So we do have try to keep a flexible approach to the way we develop and test, and sometimes we apply the kind of the Agile rules or approaches to developing software. And the key thing I find with Agile is that it sort of merges the testing phases together. And if you can work out a way to document the testing as you go, then you don't need to worry about doing the formal testing at the end. And that's something that we've done by applying the session-based test management rather. So we divide the testing into user stories, and as we test, we really record those sessions, and we're able to validate as we go through the sprints. One of the biggest arguments of using Agile, though, is it's because of that phrase, working software over comprehensive documentation. Often people read this to say that documentation is not important, but that's not what it says. What it's actually saying is that working software is a little bit more important than comprehensive documentation. So documentation is still important. It depends on the industry you work in. In the industry I work in, documentation is very important, but working software is equally or even more important. So that's something to keep in mind. And now if you do want to apply Agile, then obviously you need to do some of your prep and a bit of homework and set up the procedures, but we found that it's been really good in generating really good software quickly. The next one is test automation slide. I don't know how this slide got into it. It's got probably the most words in it. I think if you remove the word automate or automation, the number of characters will be a lot less. I think automation is talked about a lot in other articles and presentations, so I don't want to really dwell with it. My general point is that you should use automation when it's a good thing to do, and it's not always easy to find to know when that is. But what I kind of the idea I follow is that we do testing and we use automation to help us do better testing. Whether that makes us make the testing quicker or more effective, then that's depending on what type of automation you use. So yeah, I don't want to dwell on this slide too much because there's plenty of other people have talked about automation before. So those are some of the test ideas on how to kind of do better testing because of the challenges that we find in working in our industry. Such as, make sure you manage the informal testing, make sure you continue to learn about testing, and so on. And this last section, I called it freedom, but it's kind of the main title of the talk is about not using any test scripts, but still be able to validate the software. So still be able to show that you plan to test the application, and generate lots of evidence to show that you tested it accordingly and following the regulations. So let's get to the next slide. And one thing that is worth doing is saying, okay, you know what, we do requirements-based testing. You put your hands up and say, for this project, one of our main approaches is requirements testing, and because of that, we're going to be checking every specification item, and that's our approach to this project. There's no shame in doing that, but because of that, because you put your hands up and you're kind of clear, you're making yourself transparent, then I think you can start changing the process. And one of the key things that we did was that because the requirements document itself was very detailed, and we find it depends on the company you work for, but fortunately in certain projects we've got very good detailed documents for requirements. And for requirements-based testing, if you have experienced testers, you could I believe, and we do this, you can use the requirements-based testing to drive the testing without having to write the test scripts. The requirements have to be very detailed for this, and again, we use video recording to show that the software is working as intended, as specified in the requirement. And like I said before, we use experienced testers. So if they come across the requirement, they'll test it thoroughly, and they won't just test it with one simple test. They'll test it, for example, if there's an entry field, they will try to break it, I guess. That's one way to describe it. They'll enter too many characters, or they try to enter characters that are not allowed for that field, and so on. And that's the way we've been doing it now for a number of projects. I should add, we're not using this process for every project. This has worked really well for our mobile application projects that we do. That's because the requirements are very well detailed, and also the application itself is not too complicated. It sits on the phone. There's basic features. Obviously some apps are more complicated than others, but compared to some software that you get on the desktop, it tends to be less complicated. So what you'll find is that we would have a requirements document, and there'll be the 2 columns on the left, and we would export that into a new document, into a kind of traceability document, and we'll add 2 or 3 columns on the right. I've just shown you one here with the test result. And as the tester goes through the requirements, the tester will be driven by those requirements, and the testing will be driven by that. And as they test it, they'll either set it to pass, fail, or add comments if something's not quite right. The next few slides I want to show you are the slides I actually use to kind of share this process to people at my company, the company I work for, Export Touch. So these, I did these slides at the beginning of the year, I believe. This is sort of the way I kind of convince my management that what we're doing is still following the regulations, and is still doing good testing, and so I didn't want to change it. So I kind of, because part of introducing new processes into the company is being able to kind of convince people that you report to, the managers, directors. So I didn't want to change that. So this is what's happened in the past. An RDS is a requirements design specification, and that includes all the requirements features for an application. And this is a phone app, so it's features for an application on the phone. From the RDS, then you generate test scripts. That should also include a test plan, but the test scripts take the biggest amount of time to write. And then from that, you can generate the trace matrix. So the trace matrix sort of fits between the test scripts and the RDS. Now what usually happens in the past is the RDS will then be changed. Either the client requests a change, or maybe someone spotted a problem with the RDS, maybe a tester, maybe a developer, which means then you have to change the test scripts. And there's a bit of an ongoing loop with that, which means it's a waste of time, because you have to go back to the test scripts and update them. You have to go back to the trace matrix and update that as well. So that's a kind of duplication of work that doesn't really add any value. And then once the application itself is ready for formal testing, so this process just applies for formal testing. Once the application is ready, then you can start executing the test. And again, we use the visual recording tools to record and to generate the evidence for the testing, and then you generate a test report. But what we found was that there was a lot of waste in generating test scripts up front, because you have to redo some of it. And now actually, because the way the requirements were written, I felt the test scripts themselves weren't of great benefit. Yeah, I still believe that good testers, experienced testers, will be able to do very good solid testing without the test scripts. They'll be able to do good testing straight from the requirement spec. So I started to think that, the test scripts and the trace matrix together, it's not great use. And thinking of Kanban, about reducing waste, and also kind of just in time, making things available just before they're required. This is when we introduced, because of those kind of 2 concepts, we introduced a new process. And the idea is that we reduce the waste because we felt that the test scripts themselves weren't that beneficial. And also, in terms of just in time, we waited until the RDS the requirement spec was ready, and the application was ready to do formal testing. Once all that was ready, we could generate also generate the trace matrix and RDS, and that document was pretty much the copy of the RDS with a few columns on the right hand side for the tester to complete. So the tester would print out that new document, and as the tester went through the requirements, they'd be able to kind of say yes, it's passed, it's not passed, or some comments, and add a video reference. And that sort of just-in-time sort of idea kind of reduced reduced project timelines, depending on the complexity of the study, of course. But we found that it's reduced. We obviously didn't have to write test scripts to begin with. We also didn't have to review the test scripts either. It did add a bit more time when we're doing the testing, because the tester had to engage a bit more than in the past, and also reviewing the videos took a bit longer, because it took a bit longer to kind of see where the video traced back. But because of that, with the videos, what we did was add tags into the video. So if an auditor came in and said, I want to be able to see evidence of requirement 1.3, we'll be able to quickly show them the video, and there'll be a tag saying 1.3. They'll be able to quickly go to the tag within that video and see that software behaving as specified on the spec. Just to clarify, this is the formal test process. So there's still lots of other testing going on. There's unit testing that developers do, there's code reviews, and there's of course still lots of informal testing that we do. And we still do lots of requirements-based testing during the informal testing for other types as well. The biggest drawback of this approach is that this is one type of testing that we're doing for formal testing. Now, every type of testing has its benefits and drawbacks, and the biggest drawback with this approach was that it didn't really do any kind of end-to-end testing. When you look at the document that you were testing against, you were looking at specific requirements individually. So you'll test the login screen, then you'll test the welcome screen, and so on. So they're very kind of tested separately. So there wasn't much integration or end-to-end testing. So as part of the process that we introduced, we actually ended up having this approach, but as well as that, we used scenario-based testing. And for that, we did actually write test scripts. But we also pushed it a little bit, and we introduced the soap opera testing. If you're not aware of soap opera testing, is the idea that in soap operas you have very extreme, a bit crazy characters in the show, and every episode something crazy happens. Someone maybe dies, someone has an affair, and so on. So it's not real life, but it's kind of extreme. So when you come to soap opera testing, the idea is that you think of users, and you think them from a very extreme type of user on how they would use the application. And for our phone applications, these are 3 examples that we used. And again, these screens are still the ones I used to kind of show how the new process we wanted to implement. And one of them was a Highlander. So Highlander, someone up in the mountains doesn't have a connection. How do they use the app? Should they still be able to use the app, be able to store data on the phone? And then when they do get connection, they should be able to upload that data. And then we also had a door salesman, where they kind of roamed around and connected to different 3G connections. And because we work in the pharma industry, we have patients, specific patients. So this one on the screen that was always ill, so how do they use the app when they're always ill? So that sort of drove the testing, and it was more kind of scenario-based, so end-to-end testing, which I think complemented the other testing approach, which was script-free, which is just using the requirements straight from the requirements. So that's a quick summary of kind of why we use test script-free validation. So I was using kind of principles of Kanban about reducing waste and also just-in-time. It's sort of similar to what some of you might think. We're using the requirements to drive the testing. It's a bit like acceptance test-driven development, where the idea is that you write acceptance tests to begin with, and then you develop code from those. So it's similar to that. We're not using automation though. This is all still manual testing. And let me show you the summary page now. So I've gone through quite lots of things. I started with the history on working in the industry, in the pharma industry, what the pitfalls are, what the challenges are. I suggested some ideas on how you could kind of overcome those. About learning, keep learning, developing skills, apply new processes, use automation, and so on. And then I finished off with a case study on how we use a new approach. And again, we can only apply that approach on certain projects, not all projects at the place I work, but it saved us a lot of time, so it's been really positive. So thank you for listening. I'm Andy Glover. Those are my contact details. I've got a blog, cartoontester@blogspot.com. You can also tweet me at cartoontester. I work at Exo in Touch as head of testing, and that's some of the details. We work across a number of countries. We provide a lot of help to large clinical companies, and we've been able to conduct trials in 85 countries and lots of different languages and patients. So thank you for listening. I'll just hand over back to Dara.
Thank you very much for that webinar presentation, Andy. I'm just going to open the floor now to your questions. So if you haven't already asked any questions or typed your questions, you can do so now. And while you're typing the questions, I'm just going to go through one or two slides here. First of all, I'd just like to mention that a recording of this webinar, as well as the webinar slides, will be available on the EuroSTAR website after this webinar. If you join the EuroSTAR community, not only will you get access to this webinar, but you will also get access to over 600 software testing presentations, there's ebooks, podcasts, and more. This year's conference is taking place in the Swedish Exhibition and Congress Center in Gothenburg, Sweden, from the 4th to the 7th of November. So we hope to see you there. There's already over 400 attendees confirmed. And from now up until September 20th, you can avail of our early bird pricing, which will save you up to €200. And you can make even bigger savings when you register for a group discount where every 5th attendee goes free. And finally, I'd just like to bring your attention to a software testing event we have coming up called EuroSTAR Online Software Testing Summit. This free event will take place on September 17th. It begins at 9 a.m. and we'll have a number of presentations from key speakers such as Anna Hoff, Fiona Charles, Keith Klein, James Lindsay, and you can also avail of some on-demand webinars from Stuart Reid, Keith Blockland, and BJ Rollison. And there'll be competitions in place to win free places at the EuroSTAR conference in November, as well as ebook downloads and case studies and moderated discussion boards. So there's plenty going on. And if you want to register for this event, just visit the EuroSTAR conference website and you'll see all the details there. So now I'm just going to tackle a few of your questions here. And the first question I have for you now, Andy, let me just open them up here, is we need to document why a test was run, how a test was run, and why the results, and what the results were. If this is easy in SBTM, if the tester has discipline, but how do you handle that if they do not? Any thoughts?
Yeah, good question with SBTM. I think something I didn't add is that personally I've recruited testers and they've all been experienced. It's only 4 of us in our company. We are growing from 1 about 5 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, sorry. And I've always said to begin with, we'll hire experienced testers. And one of the reasons is because I'm currently busy and I don't want to spend time coaching and training people. We probably will change that in the future. So if we do hire inexperienced testers, then you as a test manager or team leader or maybe a lead tester needs to spend time with the tester to train them up to ensure that they know what to look for. With session-based test management, one critical point is that someone needs to review the testing at the end, and that can be a learning sort of process. So the review at the end is about as much as being able to find new test ideas and maybe going back to do more testing, but also for the tester to be able to learn from the review and say, oh yeah, maybe I should have done that, or maybe at this point I should have gone and did that testing. So that's that's a critical point at the end of the review. And if the inexperienced tester or someone who isn't disciplined knows that there's a review coming up, I think that would probably make them a bit more disciplined. And hopefully as more sessions happen, they become more experienced and know what to expect and know what kind of testing is expected of them.
The next question I have for you, Andy, is how do you make sure you get at least an average test coverage on a requirement without writing it down on paper or using a mind map, for example?
Interesting question. I think average level of coverage, was that, could you just repeat the question again? Sorry.
I can, of course. The question is, how do you make sure you get at least an average test coverage on a requirement without writing it down on paper or using a mind map, for example?
I think in my experience, coverage is very subjective. So one person's good level of or average level of coverage would be different to someone else. Going back, I didn't mention this, but Ken Kame has written a good article about what makes a good test, and he talks about requirements-based testing. And in that article, he often says that what you'll find is that one requirement will then lead to one test. And I've seen this a lot, where you get a requirement spec, and per item in it, you'll find one test. And I think for formal testing, that might be just about good enough. But for informal testing, I wouldn't suggest that. For our videos, we actually expect a bit more than that, so it depends on what the requirement is. But like I explained before, I gave the example of a text field. The text field itself won't tell you that much in the requirements, but I would expect the tester to thoroughly test that field. And to say what's a good average, I think it is subjective. I don't have a good answer with me right now. Hopefully what I've said might have helped.
The next question I have is, when you were recording your testing, what do you do when you find bugs? Do you stop the recording and handle the defect?
I think that depends on what the defect is. For example, often you might see a typo on the screen, and that's, for me, that's not enough for me to stop. So I'll carry on. And often the requirements are very detailed, so I can say, yeah, this specific requirement has failed, but I can carry on doing testing because I'm sort of in the zone. I don't want to stop and raise a bug, which is just a typo, so I'll carry on. If there is a blocker, like yesterday I had a blocker bug, and there's lots of requirements afterwards as well that I could have tested, but that bug needed fixing. So I decided to stop because I knew that bug would need fixing, and also I'll have to retest around the area. So for formal testing, there was I felt that I shouldn't carry on, so I stopped and raised the issue. The developer was already fixed it. So I think it depends on the severity of it, and also and the level of severity really is subjective again. It depends on the tester and on their experience. But typically, if it's a minor one, and it's obviously a minor one, I'll try to continue if I can.
Okay, we've kind of gone over time a little bit there, but there's one question that's popped up a few times, so we'll just tackle that one first before we conclude here. And that question is, what is the best video capture tool that you have used?
I used BB Test Assistant. I know there are other good tools out there. BB Test Assistant isn't free, but it's not expensive either. It does a trick for us. We can add markers, we can add comments, you can pause and then restart again. Trying to think of other ideas. You can export to different things, so we export it. At the end of the formal testing, we export all the videos to an executable, which means in theory that executable will last for years and years. It should run on most laptops and different types of operating systems. So yeah, that's and obviously you can export it to a Windows media file and a few other ones as well. But there are other software video recording tools out there, so I don't want to drive it one way.
Great. Well, thanks for that presentation, Andy, and thanks for all your questions and all your attendees. Unfortunately, we can't get through them all just now, but I'm going to compile the list of these questions, and I will get them over to Andy, and we'll compile a blog post that will be available on the EuroSTAR website after the webinar, so you can check back in and get answers to all your questions. I'd just like to thank Andy for today's webinar, and we're now out of time. Thanks again.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you for all the listeners.
Okay, goodbye now.
Bye-bye.